He says everything went well with Julian, eh?
Yes, everything went well with you.
Okay, just before we start, could I just my chances, we are making now before the time. There was a request from one member of the audience that everybody needs to. Please, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. I can't hear you. Okay. I'll have to take my mask off here. There was a request, can you hear me now? Yes. There was a request from a member of the audience that we asked everybody to keep their masks on during the lecture. So, unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about that. The person has the right to ask that. If we do say, I know that, you know, we are over the worst and all vaccinated, but there was a request from a member of the audience. So, obviously, not the speaker.
So, yeah, because never cancelled it when I was going last week. And it meant there was no need to it. There was no option. So I was doing 5 days of everything. There was no option for 5 days of 11. So then I had to do one. So
okay, morning everyone. Nice to see you. Somebody asked me to remind them why I called this course The Long View from Longwood. And of course, that was, I think, the first thing I said. And so I'm not surprised that you've forgotten. Longwood was the home on St Helena where Napoleon died. And so I'm really just saying we're looking back 200 years from the moment when he died on St Helena. That's why it's called The Long View from Longwood. Supposed to be a catchy title, probably wasn't. Anyway, today we're talking about Napoleon the Legislator. And I subtitled it on the course sort of brochure. I said, is he executing or dictating popular will? In other words, is he just carrying out the will of the people, or is he in fact dictating to the people? Well, in the first lecture, I tried to show how Napoleon emerged against the changing backdrop of the revolution. And in its first manifestation, Napoleon was totally supportive of the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. By the time he'd become a brigadier general, it had moved into its second phase. The revolution had moved into its second phase, namely the extremist phase of the reign of terror. And that was halted in its tracks by the events of Thermidor. Thermidor was the hot month, July 1794, from which you may remember that even Napoleon was temporarily damaged on the grounds of his association with Robespierre's younger brother, Augustin. Thermidor really was the declaration of the French people that enough was enough. They'd had enough of guillotinings and an atmosphere of suspicion whereby nobody's life was safe. And even today, the expression a Thermidorian denotes someone who wants to put a stop to revolution. And apparently, if you wanted to infuriate Stalin, and that seems an unwise thing to have done, the worst thing you could do was to label him a Thermidorian. Now, curiously, just because I like useless information, most people remember Thermidor now as a lobster recipe. And, whoops, that's not it. I thought there was one. Here we are. And here we have lobster thermidor, which actually is one of my favorite dishes. And I just thought you might be interested to know how it got its name, because 100 years after the revolution, in other words, in 1894, a play was put on at the Comédie Française called Thermidor to celebrate the great events of 100 years earlier. And the restaurant next door to the theatre then established a sort of signature dish which would attract people to come to the play. And that was called lobster thermidor. So although most people have forgotten all about thermidor and what it meant or what it stood for, they still remember the dish. Right, once the extremists had been eliminated, people started dismantling some of the previous edicts of the revolution. The repealed, and it no longer seemed unpatriotic to enjoy life. And the Directory, which was the name given to the government which succeeded Thermidor, seemed to be worryingly willing to renounce many of the great gains of the revolution. And by its own incompetence and corruption, the Directory began to bring the revolution into disrepute. And the émigrés, those are the exiled aristocrats, returned to France in large numbers, thinking it's all safe now. And it looked as though the whole revolution might go into reverse. Now, while there were some who would certainly have welcomed that result, there were millions more for whom that would have meant catastrophe, betrayal, and financial ruin. For instance, the middle-class entrepreneurs who had bought up church lands. And the Jacobins, they're the extremists, you remember, they might have gone to ground, but they were far from being eliminated. They were still there in their millions, keeping a lower profile, but with their principles intact and potentially a dangerous force. And what was needed, and this is obviously where we come in, was someone who could freeze the revolution at just the right point between extremism and counter-reaction. And that was the stage that had been reached when Napoleon seized power in 1799. And broadly speaking, Napoleon's program of reforms achieved a compromise which satisfied the French. Well, thanks very much. Thank you. Which satisfied the French, not only at the time, but of course, for the next 200 years. And Napoleon often claimed he had saved the revolution, and even allowing for his self-promotional bombast, the claim was broadly true. I saved the revolution as it lay dying, he said. I cleansed it of its crimes and held it up to the people, shining with fame. He's often quoted as saying, I am the revolution, in a sort of Christ-like way. What he actually said, and it amounts to much the same thing, was, people seek to destroy the revolution by attacking my person. I will defend it, for I am the revolution. So let's look at the whole program of Napoleon's reforms. And it amounts to a sort of package in a way. And I'm going to deal with it under 8 different headings. I'm going to talk about central government, of course, on which everything else depends. I'm going to talk about local government, about the law, about the judiciary, about religion, about education, about finance, and his system of rewards and punishments. So that's what we're going to look at today. Let's start with central government. Now, what was Napoleon's philosophical dilemma when introducing a new system of self-government? Well, of course, the French weren't going to abandon the libertarian principles of the revolution so soon. I mean, they'd given up a lot to fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity. And in a way, Napoleon believed in some of those too. He certainly believed in equality of opportunity. He believed in fraternity. He certainly didn't think much of liberty, because really only he had, as it were, infallible ideas, and he didn't want them interfered with by other people. So he has to really find a system of government which will give him autocratic control while appearing to preserve the principles of the revolution. Does that all make sense? So, Ashley, why is it not moving on at all? Is there something? Okay, right. Right, thank you. So let's go back. Before the revolution, we had a totally autocratic system under the old Bourbon kings. Louis XIV, you remember, said, "I am the state." And it was a totally autocratic system. Then, of course, when the revolution broke out, then the new system of government was based on Montesquieu's idea, and he advocated what was called the separation of powers. In other words, that the executive, the people who carry out the laws, and the legislature, the people who make the laws, and the judiciary, the people who punish those who transgress the law, they should be kept separate. And I'm not going to go into detail on that because there were so many constitutions during the revolution and they lasted for such a short time that it's not worth worrying now. But one of the things that they did introduce was universal suffrage. And that, of course, was a very popular move. Then in 1793, when France was in real danger from its European enemies, then they handed all power over to this Committee of Public Safety. At first, no. They hadn't gone quite as far as that yet. No, a very good question. I should have mentioned it. So they hand all power over to this Committee of Public Safety, which I mentioned a couple of days ago. The average age of the committee was 36. The youngest member of it was 21. I mean, it was a very young, radical, sort of free-thinking body. At first, there were 16 of them. Then there were 12. Then after Thermidor, we had the system which was called the Directory. So there were only 5 directors. Then when Napoleon takes power, there are 3 consuls. And then after a short time, of course, he becomes the first consul, and then he becomes emperor. So do you see how power has become concentrated? 16, 12, 5, 3, 1. And that is really what Napoleon wanted, of course. So what did central government under Napoleon consist of? And it was actually, most of it was the idea of his sort of backroom man, the Abbé Emmanuel Sieyès. And Sieyès' formula was, he said, a constitution should be short and obscure. In other words, so that people couldn't really work out what was happening. And the executive, at first it was supposed to be 3 equal consuls, but Napoleon managed to convert it into a first consul and 2 assistant consuls. And then there was a council of state, which was like a cabinet. But of course, the interesting thing is, how do these people get to their positions? And the answer is appointed by Napoleon. And then they have a legislature. And these are the people who actually have to vote on the laws. And cunningly, they divide the legislature into a tribune and a legislative assembly. And when the laws were proposed to them, now these people are not allowed to initiate legislation, they're only allowed to vote on legislation which has been placed before them by the Council of State or by the consuls. Is this all making sense? And when these laws are placed before them, the tribunate is allowed to discuss the laws, but not to vote on them. And the legislative assembly is allowed to vote on them, but not to discuss them. And you see the point of that? That it means that the people who are actually going to vote are not going to be influenced by the adverse comments made by the people who discuss it. You see it? So actually, it had the effect, in a sense, of neutralizing the legislature. And how do these people get to their positions? They're elected by electoral colleges. And what happened was that in every region of France, there was a body of electors of 100,000 men, I'm afraid only. And those 100,000 men elected a smaller group of 10,000 men. And those 10,000 elect an even smaller group of 1,000 men. And eventually, from the smallest group, the Council of State selects 100 to sit on these bodies. And do you see what the point of that is? This is how you weed out extremists and political sort of adversaries and opponents. So in other words, it's another clever way of keeping electoral control or keeping the principle of universal suffrage without giving them anything real to elect. And there was also a Senate, incidentally, which was also appointed by the executive, in other words, appointed by the Council of State or the consuls. And the Senate had the right to, as it were, endorse any laws passed. And in an emergency, you could even go directly to the Senate and get a law passed by something called senatus consultus. Well, you can work out what that means. That was used increasingly as time went on. So here's this package. Well, what do you think the French think of it? Well, all Napoleon's changes were subjected to referendum confirmation. And in 1800, these constitutional proposals were put to the French people, and they were approved by 3.1 million to 1,500. So in other words, a massive majority. And incidentally, 3.1 million, there were actually about 9 million eligible male voters in France. So only a third of those who were eligible to vote even bothered to vote. In 1802, anyway, here you have Napoleon as the first consul. This painting was commissioned by the municipality of Arras, and you can see, those of you who have been to Arras, the spire of the town hall in the background of the painting, and that was the uniform that had been prescribed for the consuls. And here's a sort of young, vigorous, dynamic, godlike Napoleon. And in 1802, voters were asked to vote on a proposal to exchange the title of first consul to consul for life. And they were allowed to write lengthy comments justifying their choice. And all these ballot papers have been preserved and archived. And one voter wrote, and I'll quote it to you, in other words, he voting on the question whether Napoleon should become consul for life, he wrote, "I would vote in the affirmative if the history of the world did not teach me that so often it has changed the heart and the mind of the person thus invested. I admire, like so many others, Bonaparte's military and political talents, but they do not lead me to believe that he is infallible. Guided by these considerations, I am not of the opinion that he should be designated consul for life." However, that wise man was only one of 8,500 who voted against the proposal, while 3.5 million voted in favor. And in 1804, the French were again asked to vote to approve the change from a consulate to an empire, a hereditary empire. And although, in fact, while they were voting, massive preparations for the coronation were already underway in Paris. But this time, for instance, a voter recorded, yes, he approves of the empire on condition that his heirs are like him. Well, this time there were 3.5 million votes in favor to only 2,500 against. So Napoleon exchanges the title of of consul for that of emperor. And here's the same painter, Henri, depicting Napoleon as a sort of Caesarian emperor. And this is the painting that people most often associate with this period of history. And another interesting thing is that very few rights that the moderating bodies had on, on Napoleon's authority were being constantly whittled away. And as I said, the senatus consultus was used more frequently. The tribunate, the ones who could actually speak against legislation, they were reduced from 100 to 50, and then they were split up into 4 different bodies. So in other words, 4 of about 12 each. In other words, to make it more and more difficult to mobilize support against Napoleon. However, that's not to suggest that there was any kind of nationwide dissent. Generally speaking, Napoleon did have the support of the French people for reasons we'll talk about today and tomorrow. Okay, so that's central government. Does that all make sense? Now we come to local government. Local government was another area where Napoleon had to tread very carefully on the privileges won by the revolution. And the old provinces, you remember I put a map up the other day, provinces by which we know France today, Normandy, Brittany, Provence, Aquitaine, etc. They were now divided into these 85 departments. And the departments were divided into cantons, and the cantons were divided into communes, and in the larger cities, that was actually only Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, the communes were divided into arrondissements. And this was a grid system which worked exceptionally well, except that by 1799, when Napoleon becomes consul, of these 40,000 communes, 35,000 were already bankrupt. And of course, you can see why, because all these people are being governed by people who are putting themselves forward for election. And they all say, vote for me and I'll give you another hospital. Vote for me and we'll have 2 more schools. Vote for me and we'll make a bridge, etc., whatever. And of course, the result was that all these communes were bankrupt by the time that Napoleon took over. Napoleon himself described them as 35,000 orphaned girls neglected or defrauded by municipal trustees. And Napoleon's solution was very simple. And he said that instead of electing the officials to these appointments, we will appoint them. So each department, for instance, is headed by a prefect. That prefect was now appointed by Napoleon. The cantons were governed by sub-prefects. Those sub-prefects were now appointed by the central government. Even the mayors in most of these communes were appointed by central government. About 40% of the mayors were still allowed to be elected, but that's all. And these prefects, of course, became very important people. They executed government laws. They collected taxes. They recruited troops. They billeted the troops. Their job was to secure favorable votes in referendums. They were very important people, dressed in a uniform, much mocked by closet royalists. And when Napoleon restored titles, nearly all of these became ennobled by Napoleon, mostly with the title baron. So this, in a sense, I said yesterday that the system had originally been designed to, as a way of delegating authority. In the end, it proved to be one of the most efficient systems of centralizing authority that's ever been devised. Now, the law, that was an area in which Napoleon's legislative program has probably received its greatest exposure. And the law of France had been historically divided into two areas. One in which common law prevailed. Common law is what we normally think of in the Anglo-Saxon world. In other words, where law is, to a large extent, dictated by precedent. And so if a judgment goes in favor of somebody on the grounds of this or that, then that, in a sense, becomes law. And so half of France was divided into an area of common law, and the other half was an area of Roman law, which was a much more fixed system of law. And broadly speaking, the dividing line between Roman law and common law depended on how originally the French had used the word yes. And so in the north of France, it was langue d'oui, in other words, the language of yes, and in the south of France, it was the langue d'oc, which was how the southern French said the word oui. And of course, the langue d'oc has survived in the name, the langue d'oui has disappeared. But over millennia, the law had evolved into myriad different variations. And within each jurisdiction, there were hundreds of feudal and clerical courts, which often dispensed very capricious and arbitrary law. For instance, there were 17 different punishments for stealing a sheep, depending on where you were living. And the Ancien Régime, in other words, the old Bourbon monarchy, had occasionally made attempts to make sense of these discrepancies and to produce a uniform system of laws. The last one had been as late as 1769, but in every case, they'd abandoned the attempt as being too complex. During the Revolution, the Committee of Public Safety had made another attempt to unify the laws, but passed so many new laws of its own, they could hardly keep up with their own legislation, let alone that of their predecessors. But the point about all this is that it had been accepted that it was an ongoing sort of area of dissatisfaction that had to be addressed. And Napoleon recognized this. And by 1800, in other words, in the first year of his consulate, he appointed a committee of 87 lawyers and gave them 5 months in which to draft a unified set of laws. Now, lawyers, of course, aren't famous for coming to speedy decisions. In fact, sometimes it actually mitigates against their interests. But in this case, to complete their job inside the deadline, they found they had to make many all-night sittings, over which at least half Napoleon himself presided. Somebody asked me the other day where he had the legal knowledge to do this. The answer was that he had no legal knowledge. But all he knew was that he wanted an outcome, within 5 months. And at these all-night sittings, his contribution was to go round the table shaking anyone who showed signs of falling asleep, saying, "Come, gentlemen, we must earn our salaries." And he himself only asked 2 questions. He said, when a law was proposed, he said, "Is it necessary? Is it just?" So those were the only 2 questions that he asked. But the outcome was that in 5 months, they do produce this huge program of legislation, which we now know as the Code Napoleon. But the Code Napoleon consisted of 5 different codes. There was the Civil Code, there was the Code of Civil Procedure, the Commercial Code, the Code of Criminal Procedure, and the Penal Code. You don't even have to worry about them. The only code that counts is the first one, the Civil Code. And when people talk about the Code Napoleon, they're nearly always referring to the civil code. And the civil code just regulated relationships between different people in the country and the whole of their sort of daily lives from birth to death. And interestingly, just to show that what we were talking about earlier weren't just rubber stamps and smoke screens, the civil code consisted of 2,281 articles, and every one of those 2,281 articles had to be debated in the tribune and passed by the Legislative Assembly. Do you understand, as we said earlier? And very often, these two bodies demanded that they be revised slightly. Well, Napoleon became infuriated by their scrutiny. He said, we've got a dozen metaphysicians here who should be thrown into a pond. I mean, he just wasn't prepared to accept any opposition, but he had to put up with it. And actually, it becomes a source of great grievance to him. But of course, it produced in the end better law. Now, these 2,281 articles were all written in simple modern French and eventually published in a slim volume to which all Frenchmen were entitled to collect a copy from their local mairie. And every soldier was encouraged to keep a copy of it in his knapsack. And they took the Code Napoleon to every corner of Europe. And it became the most effective propaganda for the principles of the French Revolution. And you can still pick up a copy like this. I mean, I have one like this, which you can pick up from any bookstall in France for a few pennies almost. So, crucially, what did the Civil Code contain? Well, essentially, it enshrined all the great gains of the Revolution. Equality before the law, equality of taxation, equality of opportunity, the abolition of all feudal privileges, no imprisonment without trial, innocent until proved guilty, religious toleration, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, the right not to be deprived of property. So it's a great sort of hymn to the liberty of the individual, as it were. And interestingly, the Civil Code, of course, has been tooth-combed to expose its weaknesses by people who, by Napoleon's detractors. And one example, for instance, was women's rights, which were certainly not respected during the French Revolution, or well, during the Napoleonic period. And Napoleon himself was no great respecter of women's sort of abilities or women's rights. And women could not acquire property, they couldn't sell property or give property without the consent of either a husband or a father. And divorce was made much more difficult for women than for men. The code reinforced paternal authority in the household. And we're often told that Napoleon himself was personally responsible for all its worst features. He had been brought up, you remember, in the southern half of France, in the more rigid framework of Roman law. And when there was a conflict between Roman law and common law, he tended to favor Roman law. And for instance, one example of Roman law which survived into French law was that all property should be inherited equally by all legitimate children. And that's been blamed, of course, for restricting the growth of the French population, because people don't want to have too many children to divide their property among. Now, of course, the most remarkable thing about the code was that in its basic essence, it's still in force in France today. Not only in France, but with adaptations in several other European countries, also in several Asian states, and almost the whole of South America. And why has this been? Because the answer is because it's a package and you can sort of buy it off the peg, so to speak, and then make suitable local alterations. Napoleon always said he would be remembered for his code long after his greatest battles had been forgotten. And although I don't think he believed it for a moment, it may well turn out to be true. And, you know, there have only been about 4 or 5 comprehensive codes of law in the whole history of the world. And this is the most recent. Well, who's going to enforce this law? Well, the answer is the judiciary. And that was an area which had been slightly fudged. And of course, for centuries, the French had lived with a system whereby judges were appointed by the king, and they dispensed the justice that he demanded. In the Napoleonic system, the executive continued to appoint judges. So it actually didn't quite meet the sort of revolutionary ideal, although the law on which they pronounced was, of course, the infinitely more equitable law of the Code Napoleon, which had been approved, every one of its articles, by the legislature. So he could pretend at any rate that he was enforcing the law that the French themselves had asked for. That all makes sense? Okay, let's go on to the confiscation of church, or let's go on to his religious policy. Now, this was an area where the revolution had been at its most zealous and its most divisive. And by and large, the Jacobins had been vehemently anti-clerical. And in urban areas particularly, the population hadn't needed much urging to follow suit. Broadly speaking, urban areas tended to be sort of free-thinking, anti-clerical. Rural areas tended to be conservative, quite religious. They'd confiscated, during the revolution, all church lands had been confiscated, and most of those lands had been sold, mostly to middle-class entrepreneurs, in order to provide the funds needed for government. And they'd also agreed on religious toleration, freedom of worship. I mean, all these things were measures which the Catholic Church resented. Education had been taken out of the hands of the church. And another requirement that had been changed was previously children had had to be named after the calendar of saints. That was now abolished. And the clergy had been required to take an oath of loyalty to the revolution, some of whom had and some of whom hadn't. And monastic orders had been banned from operating in France. And all that, Napoleon recognized that this had caused much discomfort to the French people as a whole. They were not happy with the thought that the state was at war with the church. And so, in 1802, he signs a sort of peace treaty with the Pope, known as the Concordat. And the Concordat really was, Concordat means let there be peace, of course. And this really tried to effect a compromise between the demands of the state and the demands of the church. And I would probably estimate that it had the approval of 85% of the French people. The trouble was that the 15% who did not want this, the Concordat, were the most vocal and the most activist in France. And so he knew that it would be very unpopular. So he waits until the day of the Peace of Amiens with Britain in 1802, which was possibly the most popular peace treaty he ever signed. So he waits until the day he signs the peace treaty with Britain in order to publish the Concordat. In other words, burying good news in this case. And they had a special service in Notre Dame, a Te Deum, to celebrate the new Concordat. And it all went very smoothly. But interestingly, General Delma, who was present at the service, said to Napoleon, "A fine monkish show. All that was lacking were the 100,000 men who gave their lives to end all that rubbish." Anyway, General Delma mysteriously found himself posted to Dalmatia soon afterwards. But, sorry? It's supposed to be, yeah, the one on the right of the altar, yeah, and the Pope on the left. This was just, you know, a sort of a kind of representation as the people saw it, sort of almost became, as it were, being given the heavenly seal of approval. So what happened in the Concordat? Well, first thing, Catholicism became the way they put it was, Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the great majority of the French people. So they didn't say it was a state religion, and they didn't say there was no state religion. They just said Catholicism was the religion of the great majority of the French people. They accepted the fact that those church lands could not be returned, but in exchange, the state agrees to pay clergy salaries. Very important for everybody. They scrapped the 10-day week and they reintroduced the 7-day week to great acclaim because it means you get 1 free day every 7 instead of every 10. Back comes the calendar of saints' names. Children are only being allowed now, once again, to be named after the calendar of saints' names, which is why, of course, there's so many double and even triple-barreled and sort of Christian names or first names in France, because they run out of saints' names quite quickly. Religious orders were allowed to return to France. Primary education was restored to the clergy. The bishops, who were, of course, important state functionaries as well as religious functionaries, they would now be appointed by the state, although they had to be consecrated by the Pope. So, in one way, it looked like a victory for Napoleon on most scores, but ultimately it became a sort of Trojan horse, if you like, in the French body politic. And this sort of question of who actually controlled religion and to what end sort of rumbles on for another 100 years until it's finally settled in 1904, when the French finally state for once and for all that the state is secular, education is secular, there's no religious involvement at all. And actually, there was quite a religious revival during the last few years of Napoleon's reign, which actually caused him a few problems, but we'll leave that for the moment. Education, let's go on to education. During the revolution, they'd set up a system of what they called normal schools, and they were quite similar to the sort of schooling system that we are used to in South Africa or in most European countries. Napoleon didn't like these new normal schools because they taught pupils to think dangerous subjects like literature and history. So he introduces a sort of semi-military style education called lycées. And the lycées were basically, initially, they were boarding schools with semi-military uniforms and discipline. And they were mostly funded by bursaries, a third of which were reserved for officers and officials. And these lycées became grand and great institutions, and of course, they're still very much in operation in France today. And the whole system was placed under, incidentally, and from the lycées, you went on to the école, which were like university colleges. And of course, they're all surviving in France today. So the structure has actually survived, even though the content of Napoleon's schools has changed. Although one interesting thing, in France, you know, what you do at school is totally subservient to how good you are at mathematics. And all these lycées and écoles depend entirely on your ability in mathematics, and that still survives today. And the whole system was placed under what was called the University of France, in other words, a department of education, and that was headed by a grand master who was responsible to the emperor. So that was how the system worked. Now, when I first went to Oxford, the professor of modern history was a man called Alfred Cobham, whom you may have heard of, who was a very anti-Napoleonic historian. And I always remember him writing, and I've quoted it, "An imposing bureaucratic apparatus centered in Paris was charged with regulating the educational life of France down to the smallest detail." And that was true. We used to do an exchange with a French college, and they used to come to us on the first week of April. And they were all doing, the children of the same age were all doing the Renaissance each year. There was, everywhere in France, you were studying the Renaissance at the age of 14 in April. It's that regulated. And so Cobham says, if today the rector of a university cannot appoint his secretary, dismiss a cleaner, or modify an academic course without reference to Paris, it is in obedience to the dead hand of Napoleon. However, of course, I said, well, they've had 200 years to change it if they don't like it. Why haven't they changed it? And the answer is that by and large, it suits them. So, he was, in that sense, he was executing the popular will. Right, finance was an area where the revolution had failed dismally. You remember that all those communes were bankrupt. And the weakest link in the financial system of the revolution was its collection of taxes. And Napoleon had the cunning idea of creating a ministry of finance headed by one of the most vehement of the Jacobins, in other words, the left-wingers, a man called Gaudin. And he knew that Gaudin would screw the rich for every penny that they could get. And Gaudin does, in fact, centralize the system and delegates the collection of the taxes to the prefects. And the result was that under the Napoleonic system, they charged the French people 1/5 of the taxes that they'd paid under Louis XVI, and they collected 5 times as much tax. Do you all see the point? And the reason, of course, the main reason for that was that under Louis XVI, the richest 80% of the population had been exempt from taxes. They'd all bought their way out of tax collection, decades before, not under Napoleon. And so Gaudin's system proved to be exceptionally efficient. And they trained a new class of official called an auditeur, in other words, auditor. And these are still very much in operation in France today, collecting taxes by and large very efficiently. However, I don't want to pretend that the empire was a role model of financial sort of management. They did restore indirect taxes, which of course the French disliked, and the demands of the war continuously distorted the economy. And Napoleon actually always had a sort of slush fund, which he could access, which made a mockery of all conventional accounting. Okay, lastly, punishments and rewards. Well, the revolution had abolished all titles, you remember? And in its place, everyone had been given a new title, either citizen or citoyen. And Napoleon instituted a new honor in 1802, which was known as the Légion d'honneur. And that was inaugurated in a massive ceremony in Boulogne in 1804. And if you've been to Boulogne, you may know this huge column right in the center of the town where the legions of honor were first distributed. And this was for anyone who had deserved well of France. And it was much criticized by the Jacobins. They said, you're just bringing back, kind of titles again. But of course, Napoleon said the difference was that anyone could earn his title. And somebody said, it's no need to give people, titles in order to make them deserve well of France. And Napoleon said, it is by baubles that men are governed. And of course, I think history has proved that to be true too. But interestingly, after the creation of the empire, Napoleon revives ordinary titles. And many of his great marshals then become dukes. And very often, as in the English system, they take their titles from places to which they've got no connection, to avoid having a sort of geographic sort of connection with the area from which they come. But mostly, most of the people who took their titles had military origins, but not all. And at the same time, Napoleon welcomes the old aristocracy back to France. He called it the fusion of the old with the new. But of course, people immediately said that the old aristocrats got much better opportunities than anyone else in France. And Stendhal, the famous author, interestingly, he criticized Napoleon's attitude to the aristocrats by saying he had the weakness of the parvenu, in that he had too great an opinion of the class into which he had risen. And Napoleon did become very susceptible, to the sort of support of any previously aristocratic family. And later on, he was criticized for it, but interestingly, the French could have abandoned that system, but they continued again, right up to the beginning of the 20th century. So there's the Napoleonic package. It's an incredibly comprehensive thing, and it all, incidentally, happened in about 18 months. In the first 18 months, during the consulate. And everybody says that this was the period when Napoleon was at his most productive. This was the period when he made the reforms on which his reign will be remembered. As time went on, he became less sort of observant of some of the principles on which he had reorganized the French state. But it still amounts to an exceptional and unusual package. And I think it is true that it may well be the case that ultimately he'll be remembered longer for these reforms than for any of his battlefield victories. Okay, those are the Napoleonic reforms. I'm now happy to take any questions. Yeah. Yes, at the back. Well, no, not at all. His mother, if you remember, couldn't read or write. He went to school at the military academy in Brienne, which was provided a standard education as well as giving people military expertise. And of course, he was an absolutely voracious reader himself. One of the most interesting sort of items of Napoleon which you can find are his traveling libraries, which he insisted going with him on campaign everywhere. A rather cunningly little sort of boxed set of books which he took on campaign with him everywhere. So in a sense, he was educated by the state, and half in another sense, he was educated by himself. Right, sorry, I'll try to remember. Okay. Any other questions? I'm asked, when was the franc introduced? The franc, of course, had been introduced before Napoleon at various stages, but it was introduced again, and then, of course, during Napoleon's reign, the currency became a Napoleon. 10 Napoleons equaled this or that. But it became common currency after 1848, the franc. And the franc just means free. So in other words, it had no connection with any previous sort of government or regime. Any questions online? No? 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 Good? Too complicated? Okay. Well, thanks very much, everybody.